The wind bit with a sharpness only February could muster, rattling the brittle remnants of a fence that had stood long before the cowboy's own arrival on this remote stretch of prairie. He walked the perimeter slowly, boots sinking into snow that had crusted and frozen overnight, each step echoing hollowly in the empty valley. The low sun was a pale smear behind iron-gray clouds, painting the drifts in muted silver, and the barn ahead stood dark and silent, its wood swollen and groaning under the weight of frost. He paused, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, letting the wind whip across his face, tasting the grit of winter and the ache of another year survived alone. Jonah, though he did not think of himself as a hero, had been tending this land for more than a decade. Ever since his father's illness left him with nothing but a horse, a shed, and a stubborn sense of obligation. Life had taught him the quiet endurance of solitude, and in turn he had learned to see the world in subtle shades. The difference between a healthy horse and one that merely survived, the faint hints of smoke from a neighbor's chimney, the way the snow pressed differently against a wall when someone, or something, had passed in the night. But the stillness that usually felt like safety tonight pressed like a question he could not answer. He moved to the barn door, fingers tracing the rough grain as he pushed it open. Inside, the warmth of hay and the faint scent of horses greeted him, though it offered little comfort against the wind that had followed him through the cracks of the walls. The old mare, a bay with eyes like polished amber, lifted her head and sniffed the air, nostrils flaring in rhythm with the gusts outside. Jonah fed her, measured and deliberate, noticing the slight tremor in her shoulder muscles, the way her back curved under winter's weight. Each small observation grounded him to the present, a ritual of survival and care that had become the backbone of his life. As he stacked the last bundle of firewood against the lean-to, a faint noise drifted from the edge of his property, almost swallowed by the wind. A low, plaintive whine, a clink of metal that did not belong to the barn. Jonah froze, listening. He had grown accustomed to the landscape's language, the creak of ice, the sigh of the wind, the restless shift of snow over rock, but this was different. Hesitation tugged at him. The land had never brought him surprises that demanded intervention. Its lessons were quiet, slow, and impartial. Yet this sound bore urgency, a fragile distress that reached past the edges of his understanding. He stepped outside, boots sinking again, and the snow crunched beneath him like brittle parchment. The wind clawed at his coat and hat, tugging him forward, as if urging him towards something he had not yet imagined. There, half hidden against the slope of the hill, were three small figures, shadows in the dim light, trembling. As he drew closer, the shapes resolved into donkeys, their coats matted with frozen mud, eyes wide with fear and confusion. They were chained, ropes biting into their thin necks, shivering not from exertion, but from cold, helplessness, and disbelief. Jonah knelt, instinct softening the edge of his caution. He reached toward the nearest donkey, and it flinched, ears flattened, breath fogging the air in short, rapid bursts. He paused, hand hovering, measuring his own strength against the fragility of theirs. Hunger and neglect had etched themselves into the curve of their backs, into the ragged edges of fur, into the hopeless tilt of their heads. And yet, beneath the fear, there was a flicker of recognition, an almost imperceptible appeal for aid that stirred something Jonah had not felt in a long time. The raw, undeniable need to intervene. He surveyed the surrounding land, the drifted snow, the empty horizon, and realized the quiet cruelty of whoever had left them. It was not violence that drew his breath tight. It was indifference. To abandon creatures capable of trust in such a merciless cold required a heart hardened against all mercy. The notion made Jonah's chest ache with a combination of outrage and sorrow, though he did not speak it aloud. Words here carried little weight. Only action could measure the depth of response. Jonah crouched beside the donkeys, hands trembling not with fear, but with the cold that seeped through wool and leather alike. He examined the ropes, frayed, stiff with ice, tight against raw flesh. One donkey's lip was cracked, nostrils raw, teeth chattering. He ran his fingers over the frost, noting the way the smallest movements could inflict pain yet bring hope. Carefully, deliberately, he loosened the chains, mindful that sudden motion could topple trust entirely. The donkey's breathing slowed, just enough to allow Jonah to catch his own, just enough for the quiet recognition of what it meant to be seen. He knew, without thinking, that tonight would demand more than temporary shelter. His barn was small, supplies limited, and the wind had no respect for his boundaries. Yet as the donkeys followed him slowly toward warmth, stepping on snow crusted in ice, a different thought began to take root. He would not leave them here. Not to the cold, not to cruelty, not to the hollow silence that had, until now, defined his own life. Each hoofprint pressed into snow was a small statement, an acknowledgement that presence alone could offer protection. Jonah lit the lantern inside the barn, its glow spilling over hay and walls, warm against the gray of the night. The donkeys huddled together, shivering slightly, yet no longer in the desperate, ragged rhythm they had carried outside. Jonah fed them the small ration he could spare, watching as they bent their heads to nibble, each motion quiet, hesitant, full of newfound trust. And as he worked, his own thoughts wandered to questions he had not asked himself in years. How does one measure responsibility? How does one respond to suffering that arrives unbidden, on a doorstep, in the guise of innocence? The wind moaned around the barn, a sound he had learned to ignore. But now, as it pressed against the walls, Jonah felt it differently, not as a threat but as a witness. The night had settled into silence, and with it came the first faintest trace of possibility. He did not know who had left the donkeys, nor why, and he did not know what would come next. All he knew was that he had chosen to act, and in that choice the night, the cold, and the empty plains seemed, for the first time in a long while, not entirely indifferent. Outside, the snow continued to fall in pale ribbons, blanketing the land in quiet, unbroken white. Inside, the lantern flickered, casting long shadows across hay and wood. Jonah sat, shoulders tense, hands raw, heart steadying, listening to the soft, steady breathing of the donkeys. It was a beginning neither grand nor declared, only witnessed, small and intimate, yet profound. In that moment, he understood something elemental. Compassion could arrive on its own terms, and when it did, the world, even in its harshest edges, could bend just enough to hold a fragile promise. And so the night closed around him, cold and patient, leaving Jonah with a question that would carry him forward. Who were these creatures, and who had abandoned them? The answer would come, in time, but for now, the choice had been made. Action, however small, had pierced the silence. And as the wind whistled past the barn, carrying snow and shadow across the empty plains, Jonah felt the faintest pulse of what it meant to be both witness and guardian, alone yet tethered to a life that demanded more than mere survival. Jonah had never seen eyes like those donkeys carried, wide and unblinking in the lantern light, reflecting a fear that seemed older than the snow itself. He knelt, hands hovering uncertainly over their frozen coats, feeling the rapid beat of one trembling heart beneath his palm. The smallest of the three, a gray donkey barely larger than a grown goat, shifted uneasily, ears flattening against its head as if bracing for another unseen blow. Jonah spoke softly, his voice low and deliberate, more for himself than them. "It's all right. You're safe now." Words felt fragile in the bitter cold, yet somehow they seemed to reach across the gap between human and animal, past the years of solitude and silence he had carried like a second skin. The barn smelled of hay, damp wood, and lingering frost. Jonah moved slowly, breaking off small bundles of straw to line a corner of the loft, offering it as a place to huddle. The donkeys hesitated, their movements tentative, as though each step forward was a negotiation between instinct and trust. Jonah's hands were steady but cold, rubbing at frozen fingertips, willing them to understand that warmth could exist even here, under his care. One donkey, older, with a faded coat marred by rope scars, nuzzled his shoulder cautiously, the pressure gentle, exploratory. Jonah felt a tight twist in his chest, recognizing in this touch a need that went beyond hunger or cold, a desperate desire to be seen, to matter. He brought them food, the small ration of oats and hay he had saved for his mare, spreading it carefully on the barn floor. The donkeys' noses brushed the ground as they ate, cautious, pausing often to glance at him, as if checking that the presence of help was real. Jonah watched each bite, counting, noticing the subtle distinctions in their behavior. The way the smallest one trembled even after chewing, the way the scarred donkey's ears flicked at every sound outside the barn, the way the third, a darker gray, lingered near the door, alert yet hesitant. In their wariness, he recognized something he'd thought lost in himself, the instinct to survive while remaining open to trust. The wind outside rattled the roof, a soft percussion against the stillness of the barn, and Jonah felt the quiet magnitude of the night pressing in. In the darkness, the outlines of the donkeys seemed almost spectral, fragile shapes tethered not by rope now, but by the invisible threads of dependence and recognition. He sat on a low bale of hay, hands resting on his knees, and simply watched them, letting the silence stretch between them, thick with possibility. Moments like this demanded patience, and Jonah had learned long ago that patience was often more powerful than action, that waiting could be an act of care in itself. As he observed, memories surfaced, small, piercing recollections of his own childhood, of mornings spent with his father tending animals in a frostbitten pasture, of the comfort that came from the gentle rhythm of hands on fur and hooves. He remembered how his father had spoken of responsibility, not as obligation, but as the quiet duty of seeing and responding to need wherever it appeared. Jonah felt that lesson settle into him now, in the gentle nudge of a donkey's muzzle, in the warmth that the hay and lantern light offered, in the unspoken acknowledgement that he had been chosen, however quietly, to intervene. He checked their injuries carefully, noting the rope burns along their necks, the bruises hidden beneath matted fur, the faint tremor in their legs that suggested exposure more than weakness. Each observation deepened his resolve. He would not simply provide temporary shelter. He would see them healed, fed, and safe. But even as the thought formed, the practical limitations pressed against him. The sparse feed, the narrow loft, the relentless cold that seeped into every crevice of the barn. Jonah had always lived close to the land, measuring his days by toil and weather, but never had he faced such immediate stakes. 3 lives resting entirely on his capacity to act and on his endurance. The donkeys began to relax, inching closer to the straw-lined corner, their breathing slowing into a rhythm that mirrored the flickering lantern above. Jonah knelt beside them again, running a hand gently along the gray one's back, feeling the stiffness of muscles long and used to warmth. He whispered encouragements, small and steady, letting each syllable fall into the barn as a soft promise. You are not forgotten. For the first time that night, the older donkey lifted its head, eyes meeting his fully, unblinking, and Jonah felt a rare and quiet affirmation pass between them, a bond that required no language, only presence, only care. Outside, the wind rose again, flinging snow against the barn walls in sudden bursts. Yet inside, a fragile cocoon of warmth and trust had begun to take shape. Jonah's thoughts wandered to the question that had first drawn him forward. Who could leave creatures so vulnerable in such merciless cold? He did not yet know the answer, and the uncertainty carried its own weight. But the presence of the donkeys, their tentative reliance on him, offered a moral clarity that the question could not obscure. He could not leave them. Not now. Not ever. Hours passed in quiet rhythm, Jonah moving between feeding, checking, and simply watching. Each motion was deliberate, unhurried, marked by the awareness that hurried kindness could break trust as easily as cruelty. The donkeys grew bolder, testing their surroundings, nudging one another, responding to the small gestures of attention that Jonah offered. In their cautious exploration, he saw a reflection of his own life. A slow, painstaking emergence from isolation, a tentative willingness to trust, to hope, to act. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the edges of the horizon, pale and uncertain, the barn had shifted subtly. The donkeys rested close together, bodies pressed against the hay, ears flicking at every sound, but no longer rigid with terror. Jonah stood, shoulders aching, breath clouding the cold air inside the barn, and surveyed the scene. The small sanctuary he had created was humble, fragile, but real. He understood, in a quiet, immutable way, that this night had changed something in him, just as it had changed them. He paused by the doorway, looking out over the snow-strewn fields, considering the enormity of what had begun. Outside, the world remained indifferent, harsh and unyielding, but inside, the first threads of trust and hope had taken hold. Jonah realized that this encounter, brief and unremarkable to the casual observer, carried the potential to alter the course of lives, his and theirs. The moral question that had stirred him when he first heard the chains in the night had been answered by the simple act of presence, of choice. And yet, he knew the night was only the beginning. There were challenges to come, truths to uncover, and a shadow of cruelty to confront. For now, however, he allowed himself a small, private acknowledgement. He had chosen to act, and in doing so, had opened the door to something larger than survival. The donkey's soft breathing, mingling with the flickering light, was a reminder that connection could exist even in the bleakest landscapes. Jonah's hands, raw and shaking, rested on the edge of the hay loft as he whispered to the dawn, "You're safe. For tonight, at least, you are safe." And as the first pale light crept across the frozen land, he felt a quiet certainty that this night, this choice, would mark the start of a journey neither he nor the donkeys would forget. The wind continued to hum against the barn walls, but it no longer carried only emptiness. It bore witness to the fragile bond that had formed in a single night, a bond born of quiet courage and deliberate kindness. Jonah turned to the donkeys, seeing in their tentative trust the mirror of his own longing for connection, and understood, with a slow, steady clarity, that the next step, whatever it might bring, would demand more than survival. It would demand compassion, patience, and the courage to face whatever cruelty or indifference the world might reveal. And in that understanding, Jonah felt the first stirrings of purpose beyond the daily rhythm of labor and solitude, a whisper of the extraordinary hidden in the ordinary. Sometimes, the smallest acts of care could become the turning points of life itself. The first light of morning revealed a landscape softened by frost, but Jonah's thoughts were heavy, weighted with questions he could not yet answer. The donkeys, now nestled together against the warmth of the hay, moved cautiously, ears flicking at every creak and whisper of wind. Jonah watched them for a moment, letting their quiet breathing anchor him before stepping outside. The snow had drifted deeper overnight, smoothing the footprints he had made, yet traces of other paths lingered, shallow, irregular impressions that suggested someone or something had passed by after he discovered the animals. He knelt to examine them, noticing faint drag marks, partially covered by fresh snow, and the thought struck him sharply. These creatures had been abandoned, yes, but perhaps not accidentally. The cold air carried faint odors, subtle but telling. The tang of leather, the acrid scent of old hay left to rot, and something darker, a hint of neglect that pressed against the senses like a bruise. Jonah rose, eyes scanning the horizon where the neighboring homesteads appeared as distant, gray silhouettes, smoke curling from chimneys in lazy spirals. He considered walking to them, seeking information, but pride and caution wrestled in his chest. He was a man accustomed to handling hardship alone, yet the instinct to seek truth pulled stronger. The donkey's reliance on him lent weight to every choice. The moral responsibility was immediate, almost physical, pressing down on his shoulders. He set out, boots crunching over hardened snow, toward the closest neighbor, a weathered man named Silas who had lived on these plains longer than most could remember. Silas's property lay just beyond a stand of bare pines, and Jonah noticed the occasional fresh tracks, small, deliberate depressions in the snow that suggested recent passage. He approached the gate and called, his voice low, measured against the whispering wind. After a moment, Silas appeared, leaning on a gnarled cane, eyes sharp beneath furrowed brows. "Morning, Jonah," Silas said, voice rough as gravel. "Storm last night. Caught you outside, did it?" Someone left 3 donkeys near my barn," Jonah replied, careful not to exaggerate. "Chains on them. They're cold, injured. Have you seen anything?" Silas's face darkened, a crease forming across his forehead. He gestured toward the woods. "Tracks lead back to the old ranch, north of here. Abandoned long ago. Folks don't usually go that way, but some of the crueler sort like to use it as a dumping ground. You didn't find any papers, tags, anything?" Jonah shook his head. "Nothing. Just them. And the ropes, they're cut roughly, but the burns are old. Someone meant to leave them behind." Silas leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Then you've stumbled on what some around here would rather pretend doesn't exist. There's a history with those animals. Kept too long, worked too hard, then discarded. Nobody wants the trouble. They vanish into the snow, and folks act like they never were." The weight of Silas's words pressed Jonah, a quiet, insistent force that made him aware of the cruelty he had yet to confront. He walked back to the barn, snow biting his legs, breath clouding the air in white ribbons. Inside, the donkeys lifted their heads, sensing his return. Jonah knelt beside them, tracing his fingers over the rope marks on their necks. Each abrasion told a story: carelessness, indifference, deliberate neglect. Their bodies bore evidence not only of physical harm, but of systematic abandonment, the quiet, pervasive cruelty of people who measure life by profit or convenience rather than compassion. Jonah realized that the challenge before him was not merely sheltering 3 animals. It was uncovering a truth no one wanted illuminated. He gathered scraps of paper, fragments of tags, and pieces of rope that had fallen away from the chains. Each object was a clue, a thread to follow, a testimony of intent. Outside, the wind carried snow across the yard, but inside, Jonah set about documenting every detail with methodical care. The donkeys watched him, eyes wide but trusting, their presence both a comfort and a reminder of the stakes. Over the next few hours, Jonah followed the trail northward into the stretch Silas had described. The old ranch lay in ruin, fences splintered, pens collapsed, snow and ice creeping through every gap. Here, the abandonment became concrete, half-buried troughs, rusted tack, footprints converging toward nowhere. In a corner, Jonah found remnants of old feed sacks, marked with initials that might link to a distant supplier, the faint imprint of a ledger number that suggested organized neglect. His fingers brushed against the icy wood, feeling the weight of neglect and intent. The donkey's suffering was no accident. Returning to the barn, Jonah contemplated the moral friction this discovery introduced. He could report the matter, risk entangling himself in town politics, or attempt to solve it quietly, protecting the donkeys while gathering further evidence. Both paths carried uncertainty, danger even, but inaction was no longer permissible. He understood that true responsibility demanded deliberate choice, sustained by courage and persistence. The wind outside moaned again, and Jonah sensed that the night had only begun to unveil its lessons. The afternoon shadows lengthened, slipping across the barn floor, touching hay, lantern light, and the donkey's fur. Jonah moved among them, cleaning and feeding, checking wounds, speaking in low, steady tones. He marveled at their resilience, the way their small bodies had endured what humans had discarded them into. Their trust, fragile and deliberate, mirrored his own struggle, a quiet, unspoken desire to be seen, to matter, to survive with dignity intact. A sudden sound outside, a loose shutter banging, distant footsteps, made the donkeys flinch. Jonah rose slowly, moving to the door, eyes scanning the white expanse. For a moment, he imagined the owners returning, demanding their property back, indifferent to what had been endured. The thought made his chest tighten, yet in that tension his purpose sharpened. These creatures depended on him now, and any external claim could not negate the moral obligation he had assumed. Compassion was not optional. Justice, even small and patient, was necessary. Night fell again, darker and deeper, and Jonah sat near the lantern, documenting each observation. Notes, sketches of rope abrasions, fragments of tags, a rough map of footprints. He cataloged each detail as if assembling a testimony not only for others but for himself. The donkeys lay near the straw, listening to the slow, deliberate scratch of pencil on paper, trusting him to carry their story forward. Outside, the wind pressed against the barn walls, a constant reminder of the world's indifference. Yet inside, a fragile order emerged. Proof, care, and attention as tools against cruelty. In the quiet, Jonah reflected on the moral center of his own life. He had survived hardship, yes, but he had also learned the cost of looking away. Indifference, he realized, was its own kind of cruelty, eroding integrity and leaving small lives exposed to the cold. The donkeys had appeared as doorstep by accident or design, yet in that appearance lay a test, not of strength or skill, but of patience, observation, and the courage to confront truth wherever it led. He understood now that shelter alone was insufficient. He would need evidence, persistence, and allies to navigate the forces that had discarded them. As the lantern flickered against the rising darkness, Jonah leaned back against the barn wall, listening to the gentle rhythm of their breathing. The mystery of who had abandoned them, and why, loomed ahead, pressing like ice against his chest. Yet the choice was already made. He would not leave them to cold or cruelty. In his hands, in his attention, in the steady application of care and vigilance, he had begun to wrest the first threads of justice from a world eager to let them slip. And in that moment, as the night deepened and the wind moaned across the frozen plains, Jonah felt a quiet certainty. The donkey's survival, and perhaps his own redemption, depended not on chance, but on the deliberate, patient pursuit of truth and the courage to confront cruelty with steadfast compassion. The coming days would demand endurance, observation, and unwavering moral resolve. Yet for the first time, the path forward, though arduous, felt illuminated. The wind had shifted, colder now, sharper, carrying with it the distant howl of coyotes across the frozen plains. Jonah stood at the edge of his property, boots sinking into the new snow, eyes scanning the faint traces he had followed for days. The donkeys had settled into the barn, but he could not ignore the weight of the evidence stacked carefully on the loft floor. Photographs of rope burns, fragments of tags, sketches of footprints, and notes he had laboriously recorded. Each piece told the same story: intentional neglect, abandonment, cruelty inflicted for profit or convenience. The world outside his barn might prefer to look away, but Jonah had begun to understand that silence could not save those who had no voice. He had made contact with a local magistrate, a stern woman named Eleanor, who had known the harshness of the plains and the quiet desperation of neglected animals. Her office was small, dominated by heavy oak shelves and a single, frosted window. Jonah laid out the evidence before her, each photograph and sketch accompanied by his own observations. "They were left to die," he said quietly, "and no one would have known if I hadn't noticed. Someone needs to be held accountable." Eleanor examined everything with meticulous care, lifting a brow at the details, nodding slowly. "This will not be easy," she said, "but it can be done. Truth requires patience and courage. Do you have both?" Jonah did not hesitate. He had no choice but to answer yes, for the donkeys, for himself, and for the principle that cruelty cannot remain unchecked. Back at the barn, the donkeys had grown noticeably stronger. Their coats had begun to shine faintly in the lantern light, and their eyes no longer darted with instinctive terror. Jonah observed the subtle changes, the way the scarred gray donkey pressed close to the smallest one, the gentle nudge of the dark gray toward the hay, a tentative trust that spoke louder than any words. In caring for them, he had begun to reclaim a measure of his own humanity, the quiet resilience that came from action, from bearing witness, from refusing to allow suffering to stand unchallenged. The next day, Jonah returned to the abandoned ranch, this time with Eleanor accompanying him. Their boots crunched against the hardened snow, the muted light of early morning casting long shadows over dilapidated fences and frost-covered troughs. Eleanor moved deliberately, taking photographs and making notes, while Jonah retraced the paths of footprints, searching for details he might have missed. There, half buried under snow and ice, they found remnants of rope, partially torn feed sacks, and the faint imprint of a ledger number. Concrete evidence that linked the neglect to a local supplier who had profited from hoarding animals and discarding them once they became inconvenient. The discovery tightened Jonah's chest. The cruelty was no longer abstract. It had a name, a chain of responsibility, and a possibility for accountability. Returning to his barn, Jonah took a moment to pause by the lantern. The donkeys, now huddled together, looked up as he entered, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of ease. He knew the fight was not over, that he would have to confront the owners and navigate the slow machinery of justice. Yet in this moment, he allowed himself a quiet acknowledgement of progress. Compassion, once offered, had a way of amplifying itself. His careful observation and deliberate action had begun to bend the indifferent world just enough to create a possibility for change. The confrontation came one gray afternoon, when Jonah, guided by Eleanor's advice, approached the supplier's property. The man, older than Jonah expected, appeared startled at first, his eyes darting to the bundled notes and photographs Jonah carried. "What is this?" he demanded, voice tight, a defensive edge to it. Jonah spoke calmly, deliberately. "These donkeys were abandoned in the cold, with rope burns and injuries. I have documented it. You cannot deny the evidence." The man's face hardened, then flushed, a flicker of shame or anger crossing his features. "You don't understand," he began, but Eleanor's presence lent weight, and the documentation he could not dismiss spoke louder than excuses. Jonah stayed steady, refusing to waver, refusing to be drawn into argument. The moral center he had cultivated over the weeks guided his words and presence. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He showed the undeniable truth, the evidence of suffering that could no longer be ignored. Slowly, the man's resistance faltered. He glanced at the notes, at the sketches, at the photographs of the donkey's injuries, and something in him seemed to recognize the gravity of what had been done. Jonah did not know whether it was fear, shame, or realization, only that acknowledgement had arrived. Sometimes, justice moved not with violence, but with the undeniable weight of truth and careful moral persistence. Back at the barn, the atmosphere had shifted. The donkeys were no longer tentative. They nibbled hay with relaxed motions, ears flicking at familiar sounds, eyes softening in the lantern glow. Jonah moved among them, checking hooves, rubbing matted fur, whispering encouragements that carried the quiet authority of someone who had borne witness and acted without faltering. Each gesture was deliberate, a continuation of the promise he had made the first night. "You will not be left to the cold again." In the days that followed, Eleanor worked through the legal channels, and the supplier faced consequences proportionate to the neglect. Jonah watched from the barn, hands on rough wood, observing the donkeys as they explored their new space, stretching muscles stiffened by neglect, ears twitching, nostrils flaring in curiosity and trust. The world outside remained harsh, indifferent, yet inside the barn, life persisted. Compassion had not erased cruelty, but had countered it with deliberate, steady force. In witnessing and acting, Jonah understood something essential. Courage was not always grand, but it was persistent, patient, and measured against truth. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the horizon, Jonah stood outside the barn, lantern in hand, observing the donkeys huddled together, their coats glinting faintly in the amber light. The wind had softened, carrying only the distant murmur of the plains, yet the memory of its previous bite lingered in the air. Jonah's shoulders relaxed slightly, the tension of the past days easing but not disappearing. He had acted, borne witness, confronted cruelty, and created a small, protective space where innocence could recover. That he understood was its own reward. He paused at the barn door, watching shadows stretch across the frozen field. The donkeys moved closer, ears alert, eyes calm, a subtle acknowledgement of the bond that had formed. Jonah's mind traced back to the first night, to the chains and the shivering forms in the snow, to the question that had driven him forward. Who would act when the world ignored suffering? The answer had emerged through quiet persistence, deliberate observation, and the courage to confront not with anger, but with truth. As night settled, Jonah stepped inside, lanterns swinging gently, illuminating straw and warm bodies. The donkeys nuzzled him in silent recognition, and he felt the full depth of what had been achieved. Not just survival, but restoration. Not just presence, but vigilance. Not just action, but justice. The moral weight he had carried for days lifted slightly, leaving a steady, enduring understanding. Kindness and attention, offered without hesitation, can alter the trajectory of lives, human or otherwise. Outside, the wind whispered through the plains, carrying the faint chill of winter, yet inside the barn, light and warmth persisted. Jonah knelt beside the donkeys, brushing fur, tracing gentle circles on their flanks, and whispered, almost to himself, "You're safe, and nothing will take that from you again." In that simple acknowledgement lay the quiet climax of weeks of struggle, of victory not of spectacle, but of steadfast care, moral courage, and deliberate truth. The snow stretched outward, endless and indifferent, but Jonah and the donkeys had created a small oasis of warmth and trust. Justice had arrived, not in fury, but in patience and attention. Cruelty had been met with persistence, suffering countered by compassion, and through it all, the bonds of responsibility had been honored. In the flickering lantern light, Jonah understood the lesson he had long sought. Witnessing suffering is not enough. Action, careful and sustained, is the path to moral certainty. And as the night deepened, Jonah stepped back from the loft, hands raw, heart steady, knowing that he had done more than rescue animals. He had reclaimed a measure of his own humanity, standing firm where indifference had once prevailed. Outside, the plains remained silent and cold, but inside, life persisted, fragile but steadfast. Compassion had left its mark, and for now, it would endure as quiet and enduring as the snow itself.